How to keep spiritually awake. Christians are exhorted to keep spiritually awake. As the most momentous event of all time, Armageddon, approaches, mankind in general is spiritually asleep. The fast-moving space age is slumbering, not awake to the meaning of world events. Now, let's just draw our conclusion here from what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16. So look at Matthew chapter 16. And the verses we'll look at here are 2 and 3. In reply, he said to them, "When evening falls, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is fire red.' And in the morning, 'It will be wintry, rainy weather today, for the sky is fire red but gloomy.' You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, and here's the point here, but the signs of the times you cannot interpret." So in contrast then, Christians are exhorted to keep awake from sleep and to stay awake. Let's have a look at what the scriptures say here in Romans chapter 13. So that's Romans chapter 13. And we're going to look at verses 11 to 14. "And do this because you know the season, that it is already the hour for you to awake from sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than at the time when we became believers. The night is well along, and day has drawn near. Let us therefore throw off the works belonging to darkness, and let us put on the weapons of the light. Let us walk decently as in the daytime, not in wild parties and drunkenness, not in immoral intercourse and brazen conduct, not in strife and jealousy. But put on the Lord Jesus Christ, and do not be planning ahead for the desires of the flesh." Now we can also marry that scripture to a few pages on in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. That's the last chapter in 1 Corinthians there. So that's 1 Corinthians chapter 16. I'm going to look at verse 13 in particular. Now, you'll notice these words here again. Stay awake. Stand firm in the faith. Carry on in a manly way. Grow mighty. So there we see that those repetition of those words there, to stay awake. So we do not want to be deceiving ourselves, and we want, reaping what we sow. Let's have a look at what Galatians says here in chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. Just a few pages on there. So it's Galatians chapter 6, and we're particularly paying attention to verses 7 and 8. "Do not be misled. God is not one to be mocked. For whatever a person is sowing, this he will also reap. Because the one sowing with a view to his flesh will reap corruption from his flesh, but the one sowing with a view to the Spirit will reap everlasting life from the Spirit." So we need to face the fact that we cannot afford to sleep, as the world in general does. It's as important as that. Now let's have a look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 6. Again, just a few pages on there. So that's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 6. "So then, let us not sleep on as the rest do, but let us," and here's those words again, "stay awake and keep our senses." So you can see that the Bible is continuously telling us to stay awake there, and that would insist that it's very, very important that we do that. So why do some not keep spiritually awake? Well, humans in general are preoccupied with things of life and the world around them. Now, you've probably got this scripture in mind already, but let's have a look at Matthew chapter 24. So that's Matthew 24. And we're going to pay attention specifically to verses 37 through 39. For just in the days of Noah were, so the presence of the Son of Man will be. Now here's the point here. For as they were in those days before the flood, eating and drinking, men marrying and women being given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark. And they took no note until the flood came and swept them all away. So the presence of the Son of Man will be. So we see there in Noah's day, they didn't escape the flood because they were too preoccupied with everyday things. Now, those everyday things were particularly wrong, but they were putting those ahead of their spiritual progress. So though Jehovah provides an abundance of spiritual food, most people today fail to take seriously and to apply the counsel repeatedly given. So like people in Noah's day, they took no note. Many allow themselves to become spiritually blind and deaf though claiming to be one of God's people. Now let's have a look at Isaiah chapter 42 here. So that's Isaiah chapter 42. And we're going to look at verse 25. So he kept pouring out on him wrath, his anger and the fury of war. It consumed everything around him, but he paid no attention. It blazed up against him, and he would not take it to heart. Now let's just look at the page before, and we're going to look at verses 18 to 20. Listen, you who are deaf. Look and see, you who are blind. Who is blind except my servant, so deaf as the messenger I send? Who is so blind as the one rewarded, so blind as the servant of Jehovah? You see many things, but you do not keep watch. You open your ears, but you do not listen. So we see there, don't we, that for spiritually asleep, they took no note. Now, some are lulled to sleep because the world seems to carry on normally. Economic upturns, lessening international tensions, and so forth, cause them to feel nothing has changed. Now let's relate that to 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4. So 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4. And saying, where is this promised presence of his? Why, from the day of our forefathers fell asleep in death, all things are continuing exactly as they were from creation's beginning. So that's the attitude that people carry sometimes, isn't it? Now, they try to make full use of the world, and some allow their ears to listen to false teaching. Now let's just have a look at 1 John chapter 4 here. That's just a few pages on there. So that's 1 John chapter 4. And we're going to look at, that would be verses 4 to 6. You originate with God, little children, and you have conquered them, because the one who is in union with you is greater than the one who is in union with the world. They originate with the world, that is why they speak what originates with the world, and the world listens to them. We originate with God. Whoever comes to know God listens to us. Whoever does not originate with God does not listen to us. By this we distinguish the inspired statement of truth from the inspired statement of error. And that's very true, that, isn't it? Now, they fail to recognise and heed the voice of the fine shepherd. Now let's have a look at John chapter 10, verses 4, 5 and 16 in this regard. So that's John chapter 10. Verses 4, 5 and 16 there. So we'll take 4 and 5 first. It says, when he has brought all his own out, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him, because they know his voice. They will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, because they do not know the voice of strangers. Now, let's just move on there to 16. Now that tells us here, and I have other sheep which are not of this fold, because two I must bring in, and they will listen to my voice, and they will become one flock, one shepherd. So, how to keep spiritually awake then? We need to recognize the need to remain spiritually awake. Now, 1 Peter 4:7 tells us to be vigilant with a view to prayers. So there's two keywords there, vigilant and prayers. Now, we also need to, as Matthew 26:41 tells us, to keep on the watch and pray continually. Now, it's interesting that, isn't it? Because we have that word pray there again, don't we? But it says there to keep on the watch. That's kind of similar as vigilant, really, isn't it? So you need to keep on the watch. And again, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 6 tells us, let us stay awake and keep our senses. So I suppose really keep our senses is very much like saying keep on the watch as well, isn't it? Or being vigilant. So there again, we're getting a third reminder there, aren't we? Now, interestingly, this is what happens in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. Again, it says, keep your senses, be watchful. So that's interesting that. Now, let's have a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. So let the one who thinks he is standing beware that he does not fall. So that's interesting, that, isn't it? So we can't just assume that we're standing or in good standing. We need to be certain that we are doing the right thing. And we need to keep up with food at the proper time from Jehovah's organisation. Now, Matthew 24, verse 45 tells us a little bit more about that. Let's have a look at that, shall we? Matthew chapter 24, verse 45. Now that says to us there, who really is the faithful and discreet slave, whom his master appointed over his domestics, and he is appointed to give them their food at the proper time. So we need to be determined not to miss a single spiritual meal, because that food at the proper time comes from Jehovah himself. Now, we need to be we need to keep up with both our private study and also our meeting attendance. And that is one way of keeping spiritually awake and keeping on the watch. Because that food is urgent for all. So we feed on that spiritual food with eagerness. We also follow theocratic ways, procedures and policies. We need to recognise that the organisation that Jehovah is using on earth today, so that united congregation around the world. So we need to be respectful of and obedient to those taking the lead. Now let's have a look at Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. So that's Hebrews chapter 13, and we're looking at verse 17. Be obedient to those who are taking the lead among you, and be submissive, for they are keeping watch over you, as those who will render an account, so that they may do this with joy and not with sighing, for this would be damaging to you. So we have to take a specific note that if we are being obedient to those who are taking the lead. Now, we need to refrain from criticism or careless talk. We need to find our place in God's arrangement and stick to it. Do not budge. Now, we do not want to quibble about assignments and arrangements. Now, let's have a look at Romans chapter 12 in this regard here. So that's Romans chapter 12. And we're going to look at a few verses here, but first of all, we'll start with 4. Now that tells us, For just as we have in one body many members, but the members do not all have the same function. Now let's just move on there to verse 6. It says there, "Since then we have gifts that differ according to the undeserved kindness given to us. If it is of prophecy, let us prophesy in proportion to our faith. Or if it is a ministry, then let us be at this ministry. Of the one who teaches, let him be at his teaching. Of the one who encourages, let him give encouragement. The one who distributes, let him do it liberally. The one who presides, let him do it diligently. The one who shows mercy, let him do it cheerfully." So what that's saying there is we need to perform well at whatever assignments that we receive. We all have qualities or gifts in us that we can use in order to serve Jehovah. And they all vary, don't they, from person to person. Now, we need to trust God's angels to make changes where necessary. Now, the scriptural principle we're going to look at here is Matthew 13, verse 41. Matthew 13, and we're looking at verse. We're going to look at verse 41 this time. "So the Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out from his kingdom all things that cause stumbling and people who practice lawlessness." So let's just relate that also to Revelation chapter 1, verse 16. So that's Revelation chapter 1, verse 16. Now that tells us there, "And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth a sharp, long, two-edged sword was protruding, and his countenance was like the sun when it shines at the brightest." So we see those means of the angels there and how they are effective today in our ministry. Now we need to persist in prayer. That was one of the points that came out before, wasn't it? Quite repeatedly. So let's have a look at Romans in this case. Romans 12, verse 12. So that's Romans chapter 12, verse 12. "Rejoice in the hope, endure under tribulation, persevere in prayer." So very, very important. So Jesus was outstanding in his constancy in prayer, wasn't he? There's a few examples here. We can have a look at Matthew chapter 14, verse 23. We'll just take one of these examples. So we'll just have a look at Matthew 14, verse 23. "After sending the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone." So he set a great example there in finding a solitude and using that opportunity to talk to his Father in heaven as what we should be doing. So we need to be whole-souled in field ministry and also in making financial contributions. Now, Jehovah has done much for us through his organisation. We can show love for him by full support with our time and finances. So such support was prophesied. And let's have a look at Isaiah chapter 60, verse 5. So that's Isaiah chapter 60, verse 5. Now this reads, "At that time you will see and become radiant, and your heart will throb and overflow, because the wealth of the sea will be directed to you. The resources of the nations will come to you." So we need to show love to all and act loyally. Let's have a look at the scriptural principle here in Ephesians chapter 4. So that's Ephesians chapter 4, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 to 3. Therefore I, the prisoner in the Lord, appeal to you to walk worthily of the calling with which you were called, with all humility and mildness, and with patience, putting up with one another in love, earnestly endeavouring to maintain the oneness of the Spirit and the uniting bond of peace. So now is the crucial time for staying awake. Like Jeremiah, faithful and discreet slave sounds out a warning. Now Jeremiah was severely pained at the calamity that he saw coming, but he gave that warning and the people took no note. Let's have a look at Jeremiah chapter 4 verse 22. So that's Jeremiah chapter 4. And we're looking at verse 22. For my people are foolish. They take no note of me. They are stupid sons with no understanding. They are clever enough when it comes to doing bad, but they do not know how to do good. And doesn't that ring true sometimes today? Now, if they had taken note, they would have survived the events of 607 BCE. This generation faces similar calamity. So those who respond to the proclamation of the Jeremiah class have the reward of a spiritual paradise. Let's have a look at Isaiah 29. So that's a few pages back there to Isaiah 29. And we're looking at verses 17 to 19. In just a short time, Lebanon will be turned into an orchard, and the orchard will be regarded as a forest. In that day the deaf will hear, and the words of the book, and out of the gloom and darkness the eyes of the blind will see. The meek will rejoice greatly in Jehovah, and the poor among men will be joyful in the Holy One of Israel. So we see some of the blessings there, don't we? So now is the crucial time because Satan knows his time is short. We are faced with the increasing of lawlessness, and our love may cool off if we don't keep vigilant. Now, that increased vigilance was needed to combat selfishness, materialism, and fleshly desires. Now, material prosperity and more leisure time often prove spiritually devastating because we put them in the wrong priority in our lives. Now, some who survived persecution later fell prey to other traps of Satan. Now, we dare not become overconfident. Let's have a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 12. Now, we've looked at this already, but let's just repeat this one. So let the one who thinks he is standing beware that he does not fall. So we want to beware of that overconfidence, don't we? Thinking that we are standing when we could easily be knocked over by one of the traps of Satan the devil. So we need to be vigilant. And as Armageddon nears, it is especially important to keep awake. There is a special warning to all of us now living in this crucial time. Happiness will result from our staying awake. And being awake involves full, alert participation in kingdom service. Those sleeping will suffer shame. They'll have that spiritual nakedness, and that will only result in everlasting death. Let's have a look at Revelation chapter 21, verse 8. Revelation 21, verse 8. But as for the cowards and those without faith, and those who are disgusting in their filth, and murderers, and the sexual immoral, and those practicing spiritism, and idolaters, and all the liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulphur. This means the second death. So we need to use the time remaining to incite others to spiritual wakefulness. This is harvest time, the time of the harvest, which brings added responsibilities. We need to work longer hours. The harvest is urgent. Let's have a look at Proverbs chapter 10, verse 5. Proverbs chapter 10, verse 5. The son acting with insight gathers the crop in summer, but the son acting shamefully is fast asleep during the harvest. So we need to teach others to know Jehovah and to pray regularly. At congregation meetings, we need to incite others by being prepared to make positive contributions to the meeting in our comments. Now, this requires diligent personal study, which is so important in remaining spiritual awake. Keeping spiritually awake by paying attention to ourselves is also very important. So what have we learnt then here? Well, we've learnt that many people in the world do not keep spiritually awake. And we've learnt why there, haven't we? But we've also learnt that how that we need to keep spiritually awake by the advice that's given to us in the Bible. We need to be vigilant with a view to prayers. We need to keep on the watch and pray continually. We need to let us stay awake and keep our senses, and to keep our senses and be watchful. That was just from the scriptures that we read, wasn't it? But we've also learned that now is the crucial time for staying awake. So it is so important that we take the advice of those scriptures that we mentioned. We've also seen that to use the time remaining, we need to use that to the full in inciting others to keep spiritually awake, with ourselves, of course. So I will ask you a certain question that only you can answer. Are you spiritually awake? If you would like a free home Bible study at a time and place to suit you, please navigate your browser to jw.org and follow the links online. Thank you for listening.